Curtains receive the day first. Lace gathers the palest light and releases it back to the room in softened patterns, like water slipping through fingers. The embers in the grate glow with a shy persistence, not yet asking to be a fire again, only promising warmth if called upon. Furniture keeps its quiet shapes, the long curve of the chaise, the low gleam of a table's edge, the small round reflection sleeping along the silver bell pull. Air moves with the lightest of intentions. It carries a damp sweetness from the garden, earth rinsed by night, hedges holding tiny beads of dew, roses turned inward as if still thinking. Somewhere below, a stable door opens with a note of wood and iron, then closes in the same calm key. A groom's voice murmurs a good morning meant for animals more than people. Everything is speaking in this house. Everything is whispering. The mantel keeps its still life. Clock, vase, miniature portrait, a small porcelain bird ready to take flight. The clock declines to be louder than necessary. Its tick measures the space between one breath and the next, choosing company over command. The vase waits for garden stems that will arrive later. For now, it keeps a narrow crescent of last evening's water, catching a thread of light like a thought returning. Close by the window, a writing desk rests in perfect readiness. Paper aligns with paper. The quill points toward the future without impatience. A stick of red wax lies on its side as if dozing after yesterday's seals. Beside them, a cup and saucer sit where they were left, handle angled to welcome a hand. The faint ring of tea on porcelain holds a memory of warmth. From the corridor, a distant sound, trays shifting, linen turned, passes like weather through rooms that know how to accept it. The morning room remains composed. When the door opens, it will not be startled. It has been practicing welcome for longer than anyone can count. At last, the latch lifts with care. A tray approaches on steady hands, silver tamed by age to a soft gleam. Porcelain speaks in a small chime as cup meets saucer. Steam rises, clear and fragrant. Toast leans against its plate, pale and polite. A log is added to the grate without ceremony. The patient embers decide to believe in themselves again. A small flame appears, then another, and a quiet glow begins to knit warmth into the lower air. Curtains draw a fraction wider. The garden answers by offering more of itself. Terraces washed in pale, mist laid thin across the lawn so hedges seem to float, gravel shining as if it kept a private sun. A fountain at the far end of the path turns water into a continuous conversation, repeating itself without boredom. Birds practice single notes and refrain from songs. The house listens. The morning room listens with it. Behind a silk screen, the rustle of fabric changes its meaning, from sleep arranged to day arranged. The young Duchess issues no summons. No bell is rung. The morning wants to be entered gently. Bare feet find the rug's soft side, then the polished hush of wood. The fire's small pop sounds like a greeting understood by both parties. Hands lift the teapot. A thin ribbon of steam writes a message that vanishes before it can be read, yet leaves understanding behind. Bergamot steps forward but does not take over. Sugar is not requested. Lemon remains where it is. The first sip clarifies rather than awakens. The second is gratitude in liquid form. Heat travels through porcelain into fingers, and through fingers to pulse. Letters wait. Wax seals keep their promises. One ribbon has untidy enthusiasm. Another shows the restraint of a hand that never learned how to be casual. Each envelope carries a voice that will be allowed to arrive in its own time. There is no urgency, even when news is glad. Gladness itself prefers patience in this room. Outside, mist unthreads itself. A gardener crosses the far border of lawn with a pace that has learned there is no advantage in haste. A pair of swallows rehearses a loop above the fountain, interrupting their own plan whenever they feel like it. The day, fully awake now, claims more of the room, touching gilt and glass, flattening small shadows into absence. The mantel clock accepts the new brightness and continues its gentle arithmetic of moments, never once suggesting that this one should be different from the last. Within the room, stillness is active rather than empty. The chaise holds the imprint of yesterday's rest, the way a page keeps a faint impression after words are erased. The porcelain bird seems closer to the idea of flying and yet perfectly satisfied not to. The writing desk, companion to countless mornings, appears already in conversation with a reply, not yet written. A quill lives at that uncanny angle between readiness and rest, poised without tension. The first letter is chosen for its cheerful seal. The ribbon slips free. The paper opens. Handwriting moves like a brook over pebbles, bright where the hand pressed, swift where it lifted. News arrives in little suns, cherries earlier than expected, a child's new habit of refusing hats but loving gloves, a neighbor's orchard losing a battle to birds and winning a truce with nets. Laughter appears in the room without sound. The cup returns to its saucer with a small shining circle of contact. When the page is turned, light glances off a crease and the past hour feels even more present. A second letter wears its wax with dignity. The script stands like carefully planted hedges. The topic is orchids that prefer silence to bloom, oranges that promise color and decline to deliver it, and a gardener who speaks to both as if conversation were sunlight. The room offers understanding. A reply will answer practice with patience and patience with kindness. The tea has cooled, which is a form of permission to stop. Warmth remains in fingers. Warmth has begun in the grate. Warmth is thinking about the rest of the house. The window accepts a wider opening. Air crosses the threshold as if invited every morning, which, of course, it is. The paper on the desk flutters and then decides to behave. From deeper inside the house, a bell strikes the quarter. The sound arrives dressed in distance and leaves without making demands. The morning room absorbs it the way fabric absorbs scent. Hands travel to the desk almost of their own accord. The young Duchess takes up the quill and tests it against the blotter, making a small constellation of dots that belong only to this minute and to no other. Ink darkens the nib. A moment of fencing with words occurs, then the line yields, and the first reply writes itself. Cheer answers cheer. A wry note is tuned into comfort. The letters sit neatly, not soldiers, but guests, taking their places at a table. Sentences expand and contract like measured breathing. From time to time, eyes leave the page to rest on the garden. When they return, the sentence is waiting politely to be finished. Sand settles across the page like fine rain. The sheet is lifted, excess shines and falls away. The words remain in their chosen positions. Fold follows fold with a precision that feels like affection rather than rule. Wax softens under flame and becomes willing. The seal takes its imprint and then lets go. The crest stands where it will stand forever. The second reply begins with restraint and warms itself into ease. Suggestions are made without instruction. More shade at noon, less water at night, a change of pot when the moon has grown thinner. A line at the margin thinks about kindness out loud, then decides to stay. The page keeps it like a secret someone asked to be told. The room has completed its first work. A different light stands now at the window, a confident light that does not need lace to soften it. The fire hums rather than speaks. The tray gives up its steam and rests as if it had always been cool. There is nothing for the morning room to do except exist beautifully. When the letters are tied and placed aside, the mantel clock agrees. Enough of beginning. The day is no longer waiting to start. The day has started. The garden, having sent its scents and its brightness indoors, seems to beckon. Paths will be walked, roses encountered, a fountain argued with and then befriended. The room allows its guests to leave. The house arranges its corridors for the journey. Prologue. Becomes morning without noticing the step between them. The latch will lift again soon, and the door will accept the air from the hall. The chairs will keep watching. The clock will keep counting. The fire will keep thinking. Outside the window, dew loosens on a petal and falls. The sound cannot be heard. The effect is everything. Morning gathered its certainty and laid it down across the floor in patient rectangles of light. The fire, no longer proving itself, kept a quiet company, warmth as presence rather than command. Shadows adjusted to the day's decisions, lengthening here, softening there, crossing the room like thoughts that knew where they were going. From beyond the door came those household sounds that are not quite sounds at all. Linen sighed over a rail, a latch practiced discretion, a footfall revised itself into silence. The clock on the mantel measured what it could with a modest tick, content to be noticed only when needed. The writing desk had been ready for hours. Paper rested in aligned stacks, thick sheets for formal replies, lighter leaves for notes, a pale blue for friendly hands that liked color. The ink kept its dark stillness in a glass well. Beside it, a smaller bottle weighted of sand-brown ink that had been tried once and kept for the curiosity of it. A quill angled itself toward the future with no hint of haste, its trimmed nib showing the careful bite of yesterday's penknife. A stick of crimson wax lay in its groove, a wafer of black for morning tucked discreetly under the tray, not to be needed today. A seal stamped with crest and motto slept in the velvet pocket of its case. A second, smaller seal, the simplest circle, lay beside it, used when a crest felt louder than kindness. There was weight here, but nothing heavy. The desk held tools the way a gardener's bench holds twine and shears, made ready, made useful. Beyond the window, the garden offered itself leaf by leaf. Roses stood bright against trimmed box. Bees relearned their circuit without comment, pretending they had never forgotten it overnight. A hat moved along the border, evidence of a gardener more than a sight of him, while a robin took brief possession of the sundial, as if to remind Stone to enjoy time as well. From the stable yard, a bell gave the hour not as command, but as habit worn smooth by years. A pair of swallows stitched the air and then unstitched it for the pleasure of beginning again. Fountain voice rose and fell like an old story told without the need to finish. The first letter was chosen for its cheerful seal. Ribbon slipped free, wax yielded, and paper opened with that small theater of sound only paper knows. The hand that had written it loved quickness, lines that rose lightly and then pressed, as if laughter had stood close by. News scattered itself like seeds, cherries arriving earlier than Prudence predicted. a child refusing hats but loving gloves, a maid convinced that bees prefer music in a minor key. Ink darkened the nib. The quill tested itself against the blotter. 1, 2, 3 specks, like a tiny constellation that belonged only to this minute. Then the reply began. Words stepped onto the page without argument, sentences finding their balance between garden and thought, between the view and the line. Pauses were part of the work, a glance outward to the roses, a breath, a return. In this way, the page filled as a path fills, with measured prints that neither hurry nor dawdle. Fine sand fell like gentle weather and lifted what it should. Letters stayed, dark and calm. Fold followed fold, exact but affectionate. Edges met where they were meant to meet. Wax softened, became willing, and took the seal without protest. The crest stood where it would stand forever. A dressing claimed its own small ceremony, name, place, the familiar wander of a hand that knows a route as well as any footpath. The sheet cooled and grew quiet, prepared to travel outward when called. A second letter asked for a different tone and received it. The script stood like hedges that had been clipped not harshly but with care. Its sentences descended as if by a careful stair, measured, composed, yet warm enough to be welcomed outdoors. Orchids that preferred silence to speech were discussed, oranges that promised color and then turned shy. The gardener who spoke to both as if conversation were a kind of sunlight. Advice arrived as suggestions, shade at noon, thrift with water at night, the change of a pot when the moon has thinned. Instruction would have been too loud for this room. Encouragement fitted perfectly. A margin held a thought that tried to become a sentence. And then, wiser remained a thought. A small interruption announced itself as manners rather than intrusion. The door admitted a tray, tea renewed, a slender jug of hot water, a dish of sugar lumps that glittered like obedient hail, slices of lemon arranged like an herbarium of suns. Porcelain sounded its agreeable chime. Steam wrote and unwrote itself in the air above the spout. On the lower tier, a plate of biscuits made their case for exactness. No surprise, and therefore every comfort. A cat considered the threshold and declined to enter, as if preferring to keep the dignity of being almost present. The quill was lifted to light and examined with friendly suspicion. A penknife drew a slender shave from the nib. Breath checked the point's temper. A trial line on the blotter confirmed readiness. Ink was decanted from the larger well to the smaller in a patient thread, the way a brook might lend a little of itself to a basin. The sand shaker, little ivory lid, little brass mesh, was turned and set down with the confidence of a tool that understands its place in the order of things. A third letter, unexpected but not unwelcome, presented itself at the bottom of the packet with a seal known to the household. Matters of the village required replies with both hand and heart. A school roof that would prefer slates to hope, a widow's garden that could be coaxed back to usefulness by seed rather than sermon, a cottager's request for a hen more patient than his. The young Duchess read and then allowed the room to read with her. Paper turned, ink accepted purpose, coins were not named, provisions were. A line promised seedlings from the kitchen garden. Another sent the seamstress with a bundle of durable cloth. Words made themselves into small bridges and laid themselves carefully over the places that needed crossing. From the far corner of the garden, the gardener's hat drifted out of sight. In its place appeared a wheelbarrow with ferns like green cursive above its rim. A faint lift of breeze arrived through a higher pane of the window. The flame answered with a brief, agreeable bow. The clock continued its modest arithmetic. Time gave the page what the page asked. A book of pressed leaves kept in the desk's lower drawer was drawn out for a purpose that was not quite purpose, more an assent to the pleasure of it. Within, summer had been taught to behave, ferns asleep under transparent paper, a rose petal, thinned by months remembering its silk, a sprig of time that had kept its stubbornness. A fresh leaf, small enough to make no boast, was placed on a spare page and covered with a scrap of blotting, then with another sheet, then with the closing weight of the book itself. Pressing is a conversation without words. The leaf agreed. A slip of cream paper, smaller than a letter, larger than a note, waited for a list that had been forming at the edges of thought. The conservatory would prefer to be spoken to. 3 pots of lemon verbena in need of kinder soil. A camellia that required less admiration and more water. The long table wanting clean gravel under its trays. Names of bulbs and their numbers arranged themselves like a small parade. A line for the head gardener ended with a request rather than a command. The page accepted both. From the corridor, the quietest rustle preceded a gloved hand carrying a salver. A card lay upon it, engraved with tidy importance. The morning room considered the card, and then returned it to the tray, with a kind reply written immediately beneath. Another day, another hour, so that no message would be delayed in the pretense of indecision. Courtesy does its best work when it is swifter than pride. Ink again. A neat note to the music master suggested a set of pieces for the next week, something that could be played with hands that had spent a morning writing, not fast, not fussy, not loud. A second line offered a copy of an old minuet found in the library, the corners still gilt with the idea of parties that had worn themselves out. Paper took the words and made them look like what they meant. The first letters were tied with ribbon, nothing theatrical, just enough. A house post bag folded itself open, envelopes settled inside like geese on a pond. Wax was checked, seals returned to their velvet, the penknife closed and laid where it would be found again. The blotter kept its new constellation of dots. Order returned as a familiar who knew where to sit without being told. For a little time, words were allowed to go on without being written. The window took another fraction of opening. Air crossed the threshold as an old friend. Outside, swallows practiced the art of changing their minds. The fountain repeated all the reasons it had ever known for continuing. Roses worked at the patient business of being roses. A thrush tried a few bars and then stopped, perhaps out of respect for the clock, or perhaps because even music understands when a room is speaking in its own way. There were journals on a shelf beside the desk, modest ones the house kept for its own memory, menus that had pleased, arrangements of flowers that had surprised themselves by working, notes on which corridor welcomed lilies and which scolded them. A few lines were added. The bergamot tea approved at this hour. The biscuit proving more companionable than cake. The weather's decision to be useful to gardeners and kind to walkers. The handwriting that recorded these things didn't pretend to be important. Record keeping is simply a way of thanking the future. Hands returned to correspondence, not because duty tugged, but because the moment invited. A fourth letter, slight as a folded wing, contained a sketch of a summer house proposed for a cousin's estate, round, undecided between frivolity and sense. A reply leaned into kindness and practicality at once, light enough to be moved should the view change, shade enough to be welcomed by readers and by strawberries, a door that could be left open without thinking about it. Ink drew the curve of a suggestion, the paper held it. Another pause, another cup poured. Lemon this time, thin as glass, floated and made a small sun of its own. Heat traveled through porcelain to fingers, and from fingers to pulse. The body agreed to keep company with the hour. On the plate, a second biscuit kept its promise to be an echo rather than an event. The cat reconsidered the threshold and entered, having remembered that dignity only enlarges with closeness. A tail curled at the edge of the hearthrug, where warmth and watchfulness meet. Purring began at a volume that could coexist with thinking. The mantel clock, perhaps out of good manners, allowed the rhythm to stand on its own for a while. Pens, two unused, one retired, were gathered and returned to their places. A small brass scale weighed a letter that felt heavier with kindness than with number. The result was written in a corner as a courtesy to the post. A wafer of blue sealing paper, hardly more than a thought, slipped into the drawer with the rest. Keys belonging to the desk were turned once, not to lock anything, but to remind trust that it had not been forgotten. Beyond the glass, the garden gathered color toward noon. Swallows stitched the high air in silver threads. A dragonfly drew a straight line through someone else's pattern and was forgiven immediately. The fountain kept its old conversation, rising, falling, making the same point with new water. Time moved with quiet assurance. The house adjusted its breathing to match. Morning speaking was almost done. The letters rested in their place. The fire hummed low. The desk had returned to the calm page of its own existence. Footsteps would come. Corridors would arrange themselves. Paths would be walked. Roses would offer their arguments and accept their answers. What had begun in stillness would continue in stillness, but outdoors, shade for page, sun for pulse, gravel for thought. So the morning yielded to midday, without drama, with certainty, one breath passing its care to the next. By midday, the manor grounds glowed with light, every surface warmed into radiance. The morning's mist had lifted, leaving lawns and gravel paths gleaming under the sun. Tall hedges lined the walks, their clipped shapes casting patterned shadows across the gravel. Distant woods framed the horizon, dark against fields bright with ripening grain. Birds moved among branches, wings flashing as they darted from tree to tree, their calls echoing across the stillness. The Duchess chose this hour for a measured walk through the estate. A parasol shaded delicate complexion, its silk catching flashes of sunlight with each step. Slippers brushed lightly against gravel, the rhythm soft, even, unhurried. No rush drove the pace. The stroll was an act of presence, a quiet honoring of land and air. From gardens nearby rose fragrance of lavender and climbing roses. Their sweetness carried on air, already warm with summer's weight. A path curved past the orchard, where apple trees bent under fruit just beginning to redden. Leaves rustled faintly overhead, stirred by a wind that smelled of sap and distant hay. Stopping beneath one tree, the Duchess rested a hand on bark rough with age, grounding herself in its solidity. Servants often harvested here, baskets filling with apples that would later become cider or compote. For now, the trees simply offered shade, coolness, and the subtle reminder of cycles greater than courtly life. The steward approached with notes tucked into a leather folder. His voice carried softly, respectful of the hour's calm. Reports of tenants' harvests, accounts of repairs to stone walls, requests for cloth and seed, all unfolded in steady cadence. The Duchess listened with patience, head inclined, words considered before response. Nothing in the exchange bore haste. Decisions flowed like water guided by channels, deliberate, inevitable. They continued the walk together, stopping at intervals to greet workers tending hedges or clearing paths. Each bowed, offering thanks for tools or grain provided earlier in the week. The Duchess returned greetings with grace, acknowledging each effort as integral to the whole estate's rhythm. Under her gaze, work felt less like command and more like shared labor, bound by duty, softened by recognition. At the Manor's lake, the surface shimmered under sun. Dragonflies darted across water. Swans glided near reeds, their white forms mirrored perfectly. The Duchess paused to watch them, parasol tilting slightly, thoughts drifting as reflections merged and broke apart. The steward remained silent here, recognizing the moment required no words. The air smelled faintly of wet stone and lilies, calming, expansive. By noon, the walk turned toward shaded paths beneath elms. Here, cool air replaced the sun's weight, and gravel gave way to softer ground, cushioned with moss. Conversation resumed, lighter now, stories of distant relations, rumors from London, recollections of childhood summers spent in similar glades. The Duchess's voice carried with low warmth, never hurried, each word placed as though it belonged to music rather than discourse. A bench carved from stone awaited at the end of the path. Settling there, parasol folded, the Duchess rested hands on lap, gaze lifted toward treetops. Sunlight filtered in fragments, dappling gown and grass alike. Silence stretched without discomfort, a silence of trust between land and listener. In that stillness, time seemed less a measure of minutes than of breaths and shadows. The steward eventually withdrew, duties calling him elsewhere. Left alone, the Duchess lingered, drawing slow breaths of green air heavy with leaf and soil. The lake shimmered still in distance, swans tracing circles as if inscribing secrets only water could read. Thoughts of responsibility lingered, but softened here, folded into the rhythm of wind and wing. When the sun climbed high, bells from the manor called softly through trees, summoning to luncheon. Rising with care, parasol once more unfolded, the Duchess retraced her steps at the same unhurried pace. Gravel crunched faintly, roses offered fragrance once again. Orchard trees whispered with fruit-laden branches. Every sound and scent felt part of a single composition, guiding her back toward the manor's embrace. The hall awaited, cool and dim after the brightness outside. Shutters partly drawn let in narrow beams of light, painting long stripes across polished floor. Servants stood ready with bowls of chilled soup, fragrant with herbs, loaves of warm bread, platters of trout from the estate stream. Each dish carried not indulgence, but balance, sustenance chosen for health, not excess. Seated at the long table, the Duchess received these offerings quietly, blessing them with presence rather than words. Luncheon unfolded gently, accompanied by the faint rustle of linen and the soft clink of silver against porcelain. Wine diluted with water refreshed, its coolness easing the heat still carried from outdoors. Conversation, light and measured, drifted among attendants, tenants' children excelling in studies, laughter over a gardener's goose that followed him everywhere, reflections on the abundance of orchard pears. Each tale shaped not to amuse alone, but to bind the household in shared narrative. When the meal ended, fruit and nuts were offered. Figs split open to reveal ruby interiors, almonds cracked to release pale seeds. Honey dripped golden from spoon to bread, carrying sunlight into taste. The Duchess partook in moderation, savoring more than consuming, honoring the work of soil and hand that brought each morsel forth. With luncheon complete, the hall grew quieter. Servants gathered dishes, voices hushed, footsteps deliberate. The Duchess rose, thanking those present with a nod that carried both dignity and warmth. Light from the shutters fell across her gown, silk shifting as she moved, a final image of grace before returning to the Manor's quieter chambers. Midday revealed itself not as a single event, but as a series of measured moments, strolls through gardens, exchanges with workers, stillness at the lake, nourishment within stone walls. Each fragment blended into a whole, steady and harmonious, carrying the young Duchess into the softer hours of afternoon. Instructions were written for the head gardener in the form of courtesies, please and thank you doing the work of command. The paper accepted the tone and kept it. A parcel arrived, the considerate thud of new books on a tray, binding still stiff with the idea of not yet being read, edges rough where a knife would have its small moment later, a volume on citrus in pots, an essay on weather said to have been written by a sailor with a poet's ear, a slim book of airs for the harp that promised ease and then kept it. The paper wraps, neatly folded, became liners for a drawer where ribbons live. The strings considered usefulness and were saved. Across the hall, the conservatory had been breathing all day and asked to be greeted. The corridor traded its cool for the green hush within, ferns copying the shape of patience, lemon trees keeping their private sun, geraniums prepared to forgive almost anything. On the long table, cutting spoke in the hopeful grammar of glass and water, a small pencil note, more shade here, less pride there, found the sticking plaster of a label and fixed itself gently. A pot was turned, not far, just enough for a leaf to believe the light had softened. Stakes were adjusted. A thread of twine reminded a stem how to be upright without embarrassment. Back in the study, the hour had moved but not escaped. On the desk lay a letter half written in a hand from Paris. A line in French asked for patience for the weather, which is always foreign wherever one goes. The reply borrowed the same language for the pleasure of it, and added the very English kindness of an invitation to visit when the roses forgot to count the days. A pressed violet from a previous spring lifted its shadow from between the pages of a book and accepted a new page to sleep upon. The maid brought a shallow tray with stamps and wafers, each small as a thought that intends to be remembered. A brass scale weighed parcels with the gravity of a magistrate and the mercy of a grandmother. Numbers were written on corners. A twine knot was rehearsed and then performed properly. The bag for the evening post opened its mouth like a patient bird. Envelopes arranged themselves as if memory had taught them whose company they preferred. A knock, like a question, answered in the same gentle key. The vicar's card requested a note regarding the harvest supper, how many lamps the barn might want, whether the cider could be persuaded into better manners this year. A reply observed that Light is a guest who must be properly invited, and that cider behaves well when introduced to food and lively talk. A list of platters and their destinations wrote itself as though it had known all along. Afternoon lengthened by degrees, teaching the walls a deeper gold. Correspondence returned for its final courteous round. A cousin's plan for a summer party requested a line, enough shade for conversation, enough music for walking, a refusal of spectacle. A note to the steward set the week's small mercies in order. Candles for the cottage with the long evenings, a new latch for the dairy door that had learned to argue. The journal closed itself with a sound like a book learning to be patient. Strings muted, cups cleared, the tray's gleam quieted into usefulness. Silence came back not as absence, but as a space that could carry weight. The desk accepted its tidiness, seal returned to its case, ribbon cut and kept for later, the blotter freckled by a new constellation of dots. Pens, two ready, one retired, were aligned the way understanding aligns with calm. The room held what had been spoken, written, played, and planned. None of it hurried to leave. Through the window, the sky moved toward amber, then toward violet. Swallows traced their last inscriptions beneath the eaves before settling. Somewhere farther in the house, a corridor learned the first language of lamplight. The manor drew a long breath, the kind taken before speaking in a lower voice. A short walk along the west gallery became the hour's reward. Portraits kept their dignities, which is a kind of kindness to the living. A window at the turn looked toward water meadows, where cattle invented the art of not hurrying. A heron stood as if the idea of motion had been safely stored in its pocket. The air was cooler in the gallery, the floor understanding exactly how to be quiet under a thoughtful pace. Returning, the study wore the day's progress lightly. Letters stacked, journal ribbon marked, harp covered, the tea tray gone to its next duty. From the garden, the fountain persisted in its old argument with gravity, and won by losing, as usual. A late bee discovered the sill, and, finding no further use for the morning's business, approved of the hour. At the desk, the remaining notes stacked themselves into readiness for the evening bag. Seals cooled to certainty. Names addressed themselves to place. Place made room for name. A final glance at the steward's column added the smallest correction. 2 blankets, not 1, for the cottage nearest the stream. The pencil made the change and felt it to be right. There are hours that announce themselves and hours that are content to be counted by what they have steadied. This was the latter. When lamps would be lit, the light would find a room already resolved to kindness. Evening could take what afternoon had prepared. Ties woven, measures taken, the mind put in order as a garden is, and open it like a door. Outside, Swift stitched last light into the seam between roof and sky. Inside, wax candles waited the least persuasion to become evening. The young Duchess, unspoken in name, present in every arrangement, stood a moment at the window and allowed the day to be pleased with itself. What had been written would travel. What had been promised would happen. What had been played would continue silently in the air, like a fragrance after the vase is empty. Afternoon ended as it had begun, by consenting to grace. Its legacy lay not in display but in the durable threads, papers sealed, pages filled, Instructions carried, silences allowed to do their work. The day turned another page, and the house, satisfied without saying so, made room for the gentler chamber of night. Evening comes quietly, as though it has been waiting all along at the edges of the day. The last of the afternoon's gold slips lower, taking its time across the lawns, then settles into a gentler silver that the house accepts without objection. Windows gather what remains. Each pane returns a softened version of the sky. Shadows lengthen into corridors and put their hands along the floorboards, wrapping the rooms in a calm expectancy. In the drawing room, lamps are lit one by one. Each wick flutters once, then steadies, offering a circle of warmth that makes the darkness beyond seem kind rather than intrusive. Curtains are drawn but not fully, allowing a narrow thread of air to cross the sill and cool the room. On the mantel, the clock keeps its recital of moments. Its tick is a courtesy, not a command. The day's formal duties have ended. Books are closed without haste. Letters rest inside their ribbon bundle. A chair near the fire offers its arm and is accepted. Conversation drifts lightly, not toward decisions, but toward the day's smaller pleasures. A turn along the gravel path, a page found by chance in the library, the way sunlight softened over the lake. Voices rise and fall with the rhythm of companionship. The room fills with ease and lets it stay. Dinner arrives as ceremony reduced to comfort. In the smaller dining room, candles gather over the table like patient stars. Silver returns their light in quiet sparks. Porcelain stands serene in its places. Soup is first, fragrant, calming, steam rising in elegant curls that vanish in the gentle air. A delicate fish follows with tender vegetables and a kindness of butter. Each course satisfies without weight, leaving behind balance rather than indulgence. Wine is poured with modesty. It holds a candle's shimmer for a moment, then warms the throat and is at peace. Between courses, pauses have their own richness. A servant clears with practiced grace, moving porcelain as though part of a dance that keeps time without counting. Conversation circles through memory and observation. The rose is bright even now, the swans drifting like pale ships, the orchard already promising. The meal does not hurry, it does not linger. It occupies its own just measure. Fruit concludes it with a small dish of almonds tipped in sugar, as if sweetness were a polite farewell. The drawing room receives its people again. Candles, softened by their own heat, lean upright and steady. Their flames seem to know the hour. Music stirs, perhaps the harp touched earlier, now with greater ease, or the pianoforte offering a melody that belongs to evening. Notes go into the air and remain there a while, then find their way into hallways and up the stair, so that even the house hums under its breath. Tea returns on a tray, slender biscuits beside. Porcelain gleams, steam rises carrying a suggestion of jasmine. The taste is light and floral, fitting the hour's softness. Sips are taken between remarks and between silences that are comfortable, as chairs well known. Time grows round, inhabitable. It asks nothing and gives everything it has. Beyond the windows, the grounds have shifted into shadow. Lanterns along the terrace glow against the darker green of hedge and yew. The fountain keeps its voice, gentler now, carried with the first notes of night birds. Through the open gap, cooler air drifts in with the scent of damp grass and roses closing themselves for rest. The evening promises that the day, though ending, has something gentle left to give. The hour bends toward night, its shoulders sloping into quiet. Lamps are turned low. The melody thins to memory. The fire offers its last small sparks before consenting to ash. Drawing room and dining room, and the house with them, exhale together and prepare without being told. Activity yields to ease yields to rest, rest stands and is recognized. The final cup is emptied, the last remark spoken. Curtains close fully now, sealing the hush. Steps ascend the staircase without urgency, each tread familiar, each curve of banister like a remembered line from music. The house knows what comes next and welcomes it with practiced kindness. Evening gives way to night as naturally as breath turns to dream. Night gathers slowly, like a curtain drawn with care. The last colors of evening resolve themselves into blue, then into a deeper shade that settles across grounds and house alike. Lanterns along the terrace glow steadily, their reflections trembling in the fountain's pool. Air moves cooler from the lawns, carrying the damp sweetness of grass and roses closing for rest. Above the roofline, the first stars take their places and remain where they are, needing no more. Inside, the house alters its measure. Corridors that carried footsteps and voices now repeat only the gentler tread of those preparing rooms for the dark. Candles burn lower. Lamps are shaded. The drawing room fire has become a thin arithmetic of embers. Music has put itself away, leaving the shape of melody where the sound used to be. Silence does not arrive as absence, but sits as a companion, faithful and without demands. The bedchamber, kept for this hour, answers with readiness. Curtains are drawn. Linen in the press releases lavender it has guarded all season. On the bedside table, a small candle offers a steady flame, enough to guide, not enough to intrude. The coverlet is turned back. Pillows hold their patient height. At the hearth, the last coals mutter softly, unwilling to leave and yet knowing they must. Night learns the room by small attentions. A carafe and glass are set within reach. A folded shawl crosses the chair back in quiet kindness. Hairpins make their soft, familiar clicks into a shallow dish. A brush moves through loosened hair with a rhythm that needs no counting and keeps count all the same. A ribbon is untied and returned to its drawer. The day's rings rest in a shallow porcelain shell, shining as if light had a memory of them. Slippers find the hearthrug and then do not ask for anything further. A short book lies open on the table, its ribbon firm in a half-finished page. It rises, is read for a few uncompetitive minutes, and returns to its place. The words matter less than the turning of them, the quiet drift of print across mind, the practiced surrender of thought. Beside it, a cup of warm milk waits, faintly spiced, simply sufficient. Each sip softens the hour and persuades the edges of wakefulness to become round. The house attends to itself in other rooms. Downstairs, a grate is banked with care. In the servants' hall, the last lamp keeps a small republic of warmth for those crossing later. In the corridor, a snuffer kisses wicks one by one. Each extinguished candle stoops into a smoke thread that curls and becomes nothing. Somewhere at the far end of the west wing, the clock takes notice of the quarter, and then forgets it kindly. When the bedside flame is lowered, the room deepens rather than disappears. Curtains keep out the night air, though a narrow gap invites a fraction of breeze for company. From beyond the glass, the fountain diminishes its voice to suit the hour. A single bird remembers one note and lets it go. The lawn answers with a whisper where the wind walks it. These are lullabies that do not need to be named. They thread themselves into the fabric of rest. The bed receives its guests the way a harbor receives a boat, not with fanfare, but with understanding. Sheets are cool for a moment, then faithful. The pillow accepts the weight it has been waiting for. Breath adjusts its measure. Eyes close without being told. Thoughts float outward into the large quiet, first to the landing, then to the garden, then to the grounds, until even their shapes are pleased to be still. Moonlight, finding its task, slips through the narrowest seam in the curtains and draws a silver line across the floor. It does not hurry. The night is generous with time. Stars remain steady outside the window, attentive as witnesses. In the stable, a horse stamps once and is content. Dogs in the kennel discover a better coil and keep it. The lake holds the sky as if it had been trusted with it. The orchard does its work by sleeping. Dreams choose courteous entrances. They bring fragments of the day arranged without argument. Roses bright under noon, swans writing pale numbers across water, the fingertip memory of keys in the drawing room, a biscuit that chose accuracy over display and succeeded. A doorway in the conservatory opens onto a room without walls. The fountain, indoors now, keeps its old conversation and is finally understood. The letters written in the afternoon travel and return at once, answered in the same ink they were composed in. Nothing startles. Everything agrees to be true for the time it is needed. A moth confuses the pane for moonlight and learns gently that glass can be kind as well as firm. The watch along the terrace passes, lamp tilting its own small constellations into hedges and stone. Someone closes a shutter on the far side of the house. The sound goes out into the lawn and loses itself in grass. The quarter is spoken again, farther and softer. The bed answers by not noticing. Darkness, having deepened, becomes fullness rather than lack, the fullness of release, of rooms at rest, of the settled breath of the house itself. Time loosens its belt and sits. The roof listens to weather it does not need to change. Lavender lives its quiet life in the linen. Rose remembers the day without insisting on it. Bees dream their geometry and leave no trace. If a thought returns, it returns not as trouble, but as tidying. A parcel to be sent in the morning, a line to add to a letter already sealed, a reminder for the gardener written in air and promised to paper at breakfast. These place themselves in order and keep still. Candles in the corridor finish their brief lives one by one. The embers in the grate decide on sleep. The little flame by the bed gutters and bows. When it is coaxed to absence, the room does not feel abandoned, only complete. Sleep arrives with certainty, and the house, like its mistress, lets its eyes close. The day ends as a breath does, not sharply, but with gift, leaving calm behind to keep the hour.